Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming today's distinguished speaker, Professor Olivier Roy from the European University Institute. Professor Roy, Middle East Institute Chairman Bilahari Kausikan, members of the diplomatic community, honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 5th SR Nathan Distinguished Lecture organized by the Middle East Institute of the National University of Singapore, which is proudly sponsored by the Keppel Corporation. I am pleased to now invite the chairman of the Middle East Institute, Mr. Bilahari Kausikan, to kick off the afternoon's proceedings with his welcome address.
I am tempted to say my address is care of the Middle East Institute, National University of Singapore. But let me say a few words. Professor Wang Gangwu, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for taking the time to attend the 5th S.R. Nathan Lecture of the Middle East Institute. Professor Roy really needs no introduction, and I am sure none of you will regret giving up your Friday afternoon to listen to him. Neither will Keppel Corporation regret, I think, sponsoring this event, and I hope you will continue to do so. Professor Roy, as you all already know, is one of the world's foremost experts, if not the foremost experts on political Islam. And his views are all the more important because they are not the conventional wisdom. So I'm sure all of us will learn a lot this afternoon. Now, none of you came here to listen to me. You came here to listen to Professor Roy. So I will just now invite him up on stage to give his address. Come, Professor.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. So it's a bit of a paradox, to ask the question, where is religion in the present conflict in the Middle East? Apparently, it's full of religion. So we are just out of 4 years of the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. We have among the actors the Iranians, and it's by definition an Islamic state. The main polarization in the Middle East now is Shia axis versus Sunni axis, so it seems to be full of religion. And most of the current actors claim to have a religious legitimacy. Erdogan in Turkey, for instance, so he speaks, I would say, with reference to the Ottoman Empire, or he presents himself as a defensor of Sunnism in the area. Saudi Arabia also presents itself as a defensor of the Sunni against the Shias. Iran, the reverse by definition. Qatar had a policy of supporting the Muslim Brothers in all the area. In Yemen, there is a religious dimension in the civil war, the Houthis versus the Sunnites. And we have, Morocco, for instance, which has a very clever and sophisticated religious diplomacy by promoting, transnational Muslim groups like Sufi Brotherhood, Tijaniya, Abu Shishya, and putting forward, the traditional Maliki Islam by contrast to Salafism. So apparently everything is religious in this conflict. But if we look a bit more in depth, we have a very different landscape. And for me, Islam, religion, is a stake, but not a driver of the conflict in the area. we are used, to have, since the 70s, Islamic manifestation, demonstration in the street, Islamic protest, and the call for an Islamic state, for Sharia, used to be a traditional pattern of contestation in the Middle East. But starting with what has been called the Arab Spring, we have a very different picture. The Arab Spring, whatever the political impact of the Arab Spring, there is something which was quite new. For the first time, we had popular demonstration in the street without any reference to Islam, without any reference to a religion. It was about different things, democracy, human rights, and it took, in some countries, a nationalist or patriotic turn, but it was never about implementing Sharia, an Islamic state, and so and so. A second point, which is quite interesting, is that the Israelo-Palestinian conflict, which used to be, at least symbolically, at the core of the religious mobilization in the Middle East, doesn't play any role in mobilizing the people. We have this extraordinary move, the Americans shifted their embassy to Jerusalem, and nothing happened. 10 years, 20 years before, there should have been a lot of demonstrations, protests, maybe terrorist actions here and there. And here, nothing. No demonstration from Morocco to Saudi Arabia and the Gulf state, nothing. The crown prince in Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, can speak openly of recognizing Israel, and nothing happens. No protest, no call from, of course, in Saudi Arabia, we do not expect to have any kind of vocal opposition, but outside Saudi Arabia, silence about this issue. In Egypt, in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, we have so the Muslim Brothers won the election. They governed for 1 year. They were toppled down by military intervention. But the interesting thing is that the political alignments had nothing to do with religious alignments. The Salafis entered into politics and supported General Sisi against the Muslim Brothers. So we have here a paradox, the government who was supposed to have the most Islamic agenda, the Muslim Brothers, were opposed by the Salafi who officially support the implementing of Sharia in any kind of country. So we have a discrepancy between the political alignments and the religious alignments. And if we go a bit further, to understand the geostrategy of the area, it's even more clear. It's full of unholy alliances. Let's take Turkey. So, clearly, Erdogan has religious narrative, It's not about Sharia. It has never been about Sharia with Erdogan. It's with reconnecting with the Ottoman tradition and playing a role in the area in the name of this Ottoman legitimacy, in a sense, because he considers himself as the heir of a tradition of unifying at least the Sunni Muslim world in the Middle East. And he claims to be the potential leader of a Sunni coalition. But what are the real alliances of Turkey? Now, it may change. It will change, of course. But now it's Russia and Iran. And Russia and Iran were the archenemies of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire started from with fighting against Iran. The Shia-Sunni divide was there from the beginning of both empires, the Ottoman and the Safavi. And of course, Russia has been the archenemy of the Ottoman Empire since the 18th century. But now, they are, I will not say best friends, we should not exaggerate, but they are partners, in supporting the most secular regime in the present Middle East, Bashar al-Assad. So we have here a political alignment, strategic alignment, which is open, and which has nothing to do with the different claims of the actors, with the different religious claims of the actors. As I said, the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia is also, in the same position. He claims to unify Sunni Arabs against the Shia threats, the Persian Shia threats. But he has given up what was the main topic, the main issue of mobilization, popular mobilization in the Middle East, that is the Israelo-Palestinian conflict. That we have no problem with Israel. So the opposition to Israel was the rallying point, or the smallest common denominator between the Sunni actors in the Middle East. So that's finished. And he decided, to target the Muslim Brothers as the main threat for the kingdom, which is also a bit strange, because the Muslim Brothers are also, I would say, at the core of the Sunni mobilization, the political Sunni mobilization in the Middle East. When the Iranian Revolution started in 1979, the Iranians tried to enlist the Muslim Brothers in their fight against the conservative Arab regimes. But the Muslim Brothers refused to align with Iran, and they more or less reluctantly allied with Saddam Hussein in the Iraq-Iran conflict of the 80s. So nobody can suspect the Muslim Brothers to be pro-Iran. Doesn't make sense at all. So the present Saudi government decided that the Muslim Brothers are terrorists as well as the ISIS people, which prevent any possibility to have a common Arab-Sunni front against Iran. The subsequent, conflict between Saudi Arabia and Qatar is a clear example of this impossibility and this unwillingness to have a real Sunni Arab front against Iran. So the real alignments have nothing to do with the ideological claim of religious solidarity. And as I said, but I think we have to stress that, we have no Muslims militancy in the street, no Islamic militancy. That's a big difference between Middle East and South Asia. In Pakistan, Bangladesh, Malaysia, Indonesia, we have an Islamic militancy. We have demonstrations, we have campaign. We'll come back to that later. But in the Middle East, no. Some years ago, every time, let's take the Rushdie affairs, the American intervention in Iraq, we could have hundreds of thousands of demonstrators in the streets of Casablanca in Morocco, for instance, protesting on the different issues. No, nothing. And it's not because the regimes are more authoritarian. In Morocco, in Tunisia, no. You can demonstrate in the streets. It's not necessarily in Morocco easy, but there has been a lot of demonstrations in the past. And now we have no demonstration connected with religious issues. We have demonstrations, but they are all about local situation, social conditions, economic conditions, and so on. Nothing about an Islamic transnational solidarity. That's something which has disappeared from the Middle East. The supranational Islamic militancy. Of course, you may object, what about ISIS? What about Daesh? No. Daesh is a very interesting case. First, it's a failure. They failed. They have been defeated. And interestingly enough, from the beginning of the movement which will create Daesh, so when Zarqawi, who was still a member of Al-Qaeda, started to establish a territorial Islamic Emirates in the area, he was warned by Osama bin Laden and by Zaha Wahiri that it's a big mistake, that he should avoid to establish a territorial Islamic entity because, bin Laden said, it will concentrate the attacks of all the enemies, the Americans, but also local actors, and so. And it's exactly what did happen. ISIS resisted far better than most of the experts expected, including me, At that time I said that, ISIS will last 1 year. They lasted 4 years more, but at the end it's the same. So what is specifically Islamic with ISIS? Of course, we have a nucleus of militants, Zarqawi and these people, who are committed jihadi Islamist fighters. They are committed to the creation of an Islamic state. They are committed to global jihad, to supporting and waging terrorist actions in the West, everywhere in the world, etc. That's clear. But what is the social basis of Daesh in the area? It's far more complex. Of course, we have it's very difficult to go there and to make field research by definition, But we have some elements. And we have some researchers who are local people, local social scientists, who are now reaching some conclusions. So what I will say here is coming from one of my young colleagues in Deir ez-Zor, who is from Deir ez-Zor. And he had to leave during ISIS time, but now he's back there. And he came back with interesting conclusion. So, as you know, the Kurdish political entity, PYD, they have won, on the ground, and they are controlling now Deir ez-Zor and a large part of northern Syria. The problem is Deir ez-Zor is not Kurdish. So the territory on the Turkish border is Kurdish, and so you can have a Kurdish organization, but Kurdish administration. But if you take Deir ez-Zor, then you have to deal with the local Arab population. If you are unable to make a deal, you are lost. And when he went there, he found that there is an administration, political administration and military administration, manned, staffed by local people, local Arabs. And 80% of these guys were with ISIS 6 months before. So what does it mean, And it means something very simple. To root itself in the area, ISIS had to play the tribal game. So to find allies, and of course the tribal game is always complex because it's a game of rivalries between clans, different tribes, you know. Rivalries for many things, for, of course, for wealth, for land, for water, but also for power. Officially, ISIS was opposed to the tribal system, officially. They wanted to destroy the tribal system and to replace it with an Islamic state. But de facto, at the local level, they had to play on the tribes. And that's something which we, my group in Florence, we studied, you know, and we have a book, Tribes and Global Jihad. The strange thing is that from the Atlantic to the Indus, every time you have an Islamic emirate, it's in a tribal area. Of course, all tribes are not Islamic, of course. And I would say most of the tribes are not. But it's always in a tribal area that you have an Islamic emirate. And the paradox is that the ideology of an Islamic emirate, by definition, is opposed to tribalism. The idea is that there should be an homogeneous ummah with no reference to nationality, race, language, ethnicity, tribes, and even clans and family, extended family. But in fact, they have to play with the tribal game. I found the same story in Afghanistan, you know, just after the communist coup. The communists, of course, were officially opposed to the tribal system. But by studying the Communist Party, it was absolutely obvious that the party was structured by tribalism. And that tribalism was the real political grammar of Afghanistan on both sides, the Islamists and the communists, which explains a lot of things. You cannot understand the Taliban if you ignore the tribal dimension. And you have Taliban only in tribal areas in Pakistan. You don't have Taliban in Punjab or in Sindh, only in the Pashtun tribal areas. So what does it mean? It means simply that the tribal loyalty is first, and that the tribes do invest, you know, different political actors in order to keep, you know, in order to be safe, you know, to always have somebody with the winner. ISIS was very tough, you know, in playing the vendetta game. When a clan, for instance, refused to play the game with ISIS, they killed hundreds of members of the tribe. So that's something which is rather new, you know. By the way, Saddam Hussein did use the same way of dealing with some tribal groups. But at the end, you know, what the Kurds did when they took the area, they played, you know, with the tribal leaders, and the condition was to reintegrate the members of the tribes who were with ISIS, except, you know, the few guys who were totally committed to the ideology of ISIS. So, from where, who were the real ideological actors of ISIS? Not the local. You know, the locals, they had their own agenda. And the main agenda is the resentment of Sunni Arabs for being excluded of any political role in Syria since the coming to power of the Assad family, and in Iraq since the American military intervention of 2003. So there is something which is strong and still working, the resentment of Sunni Arabs, you know. And it's true that if you look at the arc of crisis from Palestine, you know, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, these are the former Ottoman Arab vilayet, the former Ottoman Arab provinces. And of course, it was the majority of this arc was made of Sunni Arabs. And now, the only country in this place where you have a Sunni Arab government is Jordan, the smallest and the most recent of the states. But from Palestine to Iraq, going through Lebanon and Syria, the Sunni Arabs are excluded. And of course, it creates a lot of frustration, and many Sunni Arabs tend to look for any opportunities to contest the existing order. So the strength of Daesh was to provide an alternative by precisely playing a transnational ideology, and it failed. It failed. So the issue of the Sunni Arab frustration is still on the table, and it might create some problems later. But the committed jihadists didn't come from the area. They come from what I call the global jihad. The best fighting units of Daesh were made of volunteers coming from the West by thousands, from former Soviet Union, and from some Arab countries. A lot of Tunisians, some Moroccans, some Saudis, very few Egyptians, which is also a paradox. In Egypt, the Muslim Brothers have been crushed by the government on General Sisi. There has been a huge repression. Thousands of young demonstrators have been killed in the streets. So, in 2013, 2014. So we expected an Islamic radicalization among the new generation of the younger Muslim Brothers. The leadership is in jail. So the Muslim Brothers are a very structured organization, and it's a gerontocracy. But the leadership is in jail. So the feeling among us was, okay, the young guys now, they have no leaders able to control them, they will go for jihad. They didn't. We didn't find many Egyptians in Syria, and among them nobody known as a Muslim brother. In Sinai, the Islamic movement in Sinai is made of local tribal people. You don't find, or you may find some, but you have no significant group of former Muslim brothers with the armed Islamic opposition in Egypt. So once again, it shows that Islam is no more a potential for political mobilization, for radical mobilization. We have a strange discrepancy between the fact that the most radical people are coming from non-Muslim countries, from Europe. But even in Europe, these young volunteers who join Iraq are very isolated. They are not the expression of, a movement of opposition coming from the Muslim population living in Europe. So we know the way, they are not coming from the mosque. Most of them are self-radicalized. And we have an astonishing percentage of converts. 25% of the volunteers coming from the West to fight with ISIS in Syria and Iraq were and are converts. And a strange phenomenon, this is true since the end of the 90s. At that time, they used to join Al-Qaeda. But the proportion of the converts is the same, has been the same for 20 years. The new thing is the feminization. We have more and more women, young women, joining jihad. So the conclusion is that jihad is not really taking roots in the Middle East, where the place of waging jihad, it's not waged by local people. Or when they claim to wage a jihad, it's for local reasons and conditions. So it doesn't mean that Islam doesn't play a role. But here we have to make a distinction, as I said, between the Middle East and South and Far East Asia. As I said, in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Malaysia, Indonesia, we have demonstrations for achieving some Muslim agenda. But there are two things which are interesting. First, it's not a revolutionary movement which is trying to topple the existing regimes. There is ambivalent relationship between the street demonstrations, against blasphemy, apostasy, and things like that, and the attitude of the regimes, all the regimes. There is some sort of complacency. So we are not confronted by secular regimes fighting an Islamic insurrection. No, it's far more complex, the relationship. And the agenda of the demonstrators is not a political agenda in the strict sense of the term, to establish an Islamic government. They want the government to implement, to take a decision on some issues. And if we look at these issues, it's less and less, about implementing Sharia, generally speaking. It's about, I would say, very precise topic. Roughly speaking, we have three topics: apostasy, blasphemy, and more recently, the fight against homosexuality. And that is strange in a sense, because here the idea is that the threat is inside the society. Blasphemy, so the Rushdie affair, it was somebody in the West who was blasphemating against the Prophet. So it was still part of some sort, Western imperialism against Muslim countries. But now, the people who are accused from blasphemy are from the different societies, from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, and so. And it's a bit difficult to claim that they are Western agents or what you want. It's an inner issue. Apostasy is the same, Apostasy, so the idea that somebody who is Muslim could convert to Christianity or another religion. Of course, you can say apostasy has always been forbidden in Islam. Maybe. But it was never at the top of the political issues. Never. No. It was an issue of Islamic courts. It was not a way to mobilize public opinion. No. And now the public opinion, I say, is mobilizing around this issue of apostasy. What does it mean? It means that there is a sense of fragility of the Muslim community, that it might disappear, that people might leave Islam, and that we have to fight to close the boundaries, to close the door. And the campaign against homosexuality is also very interesting because it's new, and the way it expresses. So there was a declaration of Mohammed Izzou and Mohammed Yusuf of the Jakim institution in Malaysia, I think last week. He explained, why his organization is waging a campaign against homosexuality the following way. He said there are more and more gays in Malaysia. Well, how does he know? But, for him it's obvious. There are more and more, so we should fight against. But how to fight? And he said, we have to make a difference between the sin and the sinner, and we have to implement curing homosexuals. Well, I am working on religion in general, and I said, well, this argumentation, I know it very well. That's the argumentation of the American evangelicals. That's exactly the way they present, the issue of fighting homosexuality. The issue of blasphemy, so in the West now it's too late to go back to blasphemy, and Ireland has just abolished one of the last European laws against blasphemy. But it's clear now that the religious faith communities in Europe, the Christians, are now more and more going to the courts, to ask to be protected against offense towards religion. And recently, strangely enough, in a sense, recently last week, the European Court of Human Rights has said, yes, they are right. The court has endorsed the sentencing of an Austrian woman who said something bad about the Prophet Muhammad. Normally in Europe, it's considered that freedom of expression, and so you cannot do anything. She was sued by some Muslim organization in Austria, and the court said yes, she has touched, the sensitivity of Muslims, and so she should be fined, and she has been fined, for tort, damages, emotional damages. So here we have an interesting convergence with the different kind of fundamentalist or conservative religious actors who feel, both in Muslim countries and in the West, more and more in a minority. The idea that the secularism is winning. And secularism is not just, a cultural plot from the West. Secularism is starting inside. You have in Egypt, some weeks ago, the government, General Sisi, they made a law banning atheism. So first, how do you can ban atheism? It's a bit but it means that nobody has the right to say, well, by the way, I am not sure that God exists. And this law is very interesting because there has never been such a law. And I think that most of the religious people didn't ask for such a law. It means that, in fact, if we ban atheism, it's because there is atheism. We have a growing movement of minority movement, of course. It started from the Maghreb. The Maghreb is more liberal in this sense. The Maghreb is a good laboratory because we see trends which will develop elsewhere and with less repression. And these trends are precisely conversions, apostasy. We have now officially recognized Protestant church in Algeria, which is made of converts. Of course, when the head of the church asked to be recognized as the General Secretary of the Protestant Church, the government, the administration first said, no, you are a Muslim. The guy said, I converted. I'm no more a Muslim, I'm a Christian now. The government, the administration said, no, there is no conversion in Islam. It's apostasy. The guy said, where is apostasy in the Algerian law? There is no law on apostasy. And there is a law on freedom of religion. And at the end, he won, which is interesting. Same phenomenon in Tunisia. So what I'm seeing now is a shift, I would say, from political Islam to the issue of what is the room for religion in societies which are more and more secularized. Of course, the more secularized societies are in the West. But there is this feeling in many Muslim countries that secularism is coming from inside, and no more as a foreign political tool. And there is a sense of uncertainty, if I can say that, For me, and I will stop on the end of that, the main reason is the deculturation of religion, which is done in the West. The fact that the dominant culture is no more a Christian culture. It used to be a secularized Christian culture until the 60s, but now no more. It's a very different culture. And in most of the Muslim countries, of course, you still have a dominant Muslim culture, of course. But the traditional forms of Islam are more and more undermined by globalization, by urbanization, by mobility, by demographic changes, and by, I would say, a collapse of clerical institutions. The states have the control now of the clerical institutions. They took control from Morocco to Malaysia. They took control. When you have an official clergy where the imams are civil servants, you do not have, the spirituality that many people are looking for in faith communities. The statization of religion is a way, is a tool of secularization of religion everywhere. Of course, we have, and in Indonesia, for instance, a lot of religious faith brotherhood, not in the sense of Muslim brothers, but religious non-state brotherhood, association, fraternities, and so on, which are under the state structure and where people join voluntarily and could express culturally embedded and socially embedded Islam. But the states are going against that. A good example, and it is Malay's point, take Turkey. Turkey, the AKP, is a political organization. The AKP never constructed a religious organization. They never had imams, mosques, religious institutions, and things like that. It was a political movement. Beside the AKP, you had the Gülen movement. The Gülen movement, at the beginning, was the reverse. Yeah. It was a civil society movement, a brotherhood, which was totally outside a state structure, and which was which aim was to bring new generation of religiously trained middle class and civil servant people who will then join the civil service. So the alliance was obvious. The Gülen were providing religious cadres and votes, while the AKP was in charge of politics. That was good. Until the coup. Because the AKP tried, the Gülen, or a part of the Gülen, that's another story, really tried to take the power. And so Erdogan has destroyed the Gülen. But by destroying the Gülen, for instance, he has deprived Turkey of a soft power. The Gülen were very active abroad. They had networks of schools, predicators, and they were a good support of Turkish soft power. And it has been destroyed by Erdogan himself, who, of course, is politicizing religion, and more than that, transforming religion into a state structure, which, in a sense, is the end of real religion. So we have these problems now almost everywhere. The policy of Islamizations, paradoxically, are ending into a form of secularization of the Muslim countries, and the most obvious example is Iran, which is probably now, after 30 years of Islamic regime, the most secular society in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Roy. We now invite our chairman to return to the stage for the question and answer session. Ladies and gentlemen, if you do have a question, there is a microphone being moved up in the middle of the aisle. Please make your questions to the microphone.
Professor Ra has been very kind to agree to take questions. May I remind you that this is a question and answer session. It is not a time to make statements. So if you have a question, please identify yourself and keep it to the point and succinct. With that, who would want to ask the first question?
Only statements.
Oh. Oh yes, I forgot to say, there is a mic, so please use it.
Do you see the death of the Islamic State, or do you see that ISC is morphing into another entity? It is taking the shape of another organization, another structure. Thank you.
As I said, we found that all Islamic Emirates are in fact hinged on local situation of conflicts. No. And from Atlantic to Indus, it's tribalism. It's very interesting to see how this kind of conflicts, who could have been, almost ignored by the international community as long as it was just, a local conflict, change of nature when the leaders decide to make allegiance, to pledge allegiance to ISIS or to Al-Qaeda. And, they are very opportunistic on that. Before 2011, they used to pledge allegiance to Al-Qaeda. And then, ISIS was there, so they said, okay, we pledge allegiance to ISIS. Now, what they will do, we'll see. So it means that it's not really globalization of ISIS. It's some sort of a proliferation, from spot to spot. It's not a general movement. The rest of the population doesn't follow. And why some leaders, who very often it's the case in Mali, for instance, some Tuareg leaders, they were not Islamist at all. And one morning they come, and so they call for jihad, and they say, now we are part of ISIS. It's very difficult to say if the guy are sincere, that they reconvert, that they are born-again Muslims, and I think in many cases it's true. They reshape them, not only the movement, but themselves, in an Islamic form of expression. But as I said, we have an Islamization of traditional conflict. Yeah. Smuggling is recast, in some sort of internalization. They fight against the state. Instead of fighting the state from below, they fight now the state from above, saying we represent a transnational movement, and you, the state, you are just, a local actor. So they revert the traditional relations between the state central and the tribes peripheric. Now they are the center. Of course, they have also for the militants more motivation, and they can enlist volunteers from abroad who usually are very good fighters. But except ISIS here is an exception. ISIS gave responsibilities to foreign fighters, while in Mali, Yemen, Taliban, other areas, we have no evidence that the local Islamic Emirates is giving any responsibility to foreign fighters. You know, the foreign fighters are here as first line and suicide attackers. So it's a benefit, a side benefit from joining global jihad. You have new troops, better troops, but in fact, the game at the local level is political and anthropological in a sense. So it's why we should never forget to have a political perception of this kind of conflict instead of having an ideological perception of this kind of conflicts.
Thank you.
Anthony Teo. Professor Ra, thank you for your presentation. I have a question that has to do with your sense of perception of of non-ideologue Islam, but that is very much in British, Bangladesh, Malaysia, and India. But when we come to the Maghreb, which is Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, then the most fragile place seems like Tunisia. Whereas in Morocco, the Franco-Moroccan Islamic political approach and the Algerian FLN, Fifth Republic type, is the same group, have that stability. But the one which is more secular in Tunisia seems to be most fragile. Why is that?
The last
The one in Tunisia seems to be more fragile. Why?
Tunisia is fragile for good reasons also, you know. You have a certain democracy, you do not have a strong state. The Ben Ali regime was a despotic regime, but it has never been able to really control the society. There's always the UGTT, the union, for instance, the workers' union, were able to keep an autonomy during all the time of the dictatorship. It's an open country. You know, I think that more than 10% of the Tunisians don't live in Tunisia. They are in France, in Italy, in the USA, and so. So you have a lot of going. Then in Tunisia, you have a freedom of expression, not in terms of the media and so, but in terms of the streets. Yeah. You can, for instance, eat during Ramadan, in Tunis at least, without being harassed, you know, by conservative Muslim. You can say that you are an atheist. So you have an association of atheists and so. The fragility of the country now is mainly economic. The economy is in poor shape. But this, the paradox of Tunisia is that it's one of the countries which exported the highest number of jihadists in terms of the global population. The countries who are sending the most, the highest percentage of jihadists compared to the Muslim population is Tunisia, Belgium, and Kosovo. It's not Saudi Arabia, it's not Egypt at all, it's even not Morocco. But roughly speaking, the liberal trends are stronger in North Africa, but also radicalization. And there is a link between both, you know. Take Morocco. You have no jihadists inside Morocco, but the Moroccans are overrepresented among the Western European jihadi. If you look at Denmark, Belgium, Germany, Holland, you would think that the majority of jihadists would be from Turkish origin, because the majority of the Muslims are from Turkish origin. Not at all. We have almost no Turks. No first, second, or third generation of Turks among the jihadi. It's a total exception. But we have Moroccans, second generation Moroccans. The most represented group among the jihadists are second generation Moroccans in France, Spain, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, and so on and so on. And I think that the issue here, it's the highest level of deculturation of Islam. Because one of the big issues of the Maghreb is the issue of language and of education. It's not just two languages, it's three languages, and sometimes four. You have your family the native language, which could be Darija, so the Arabic, the local Arabic, which should be Berber. You are educated in a mix of French and classical Arabic. And the best people master all the three. Yeah, they are very good, in the three languages, but many don't master any of this language. And they have a problem, to when they want to study Islam. Either they have to study classical Arabic, and very few of them do that, or they go for French, English, German to read, these small Salafi booklets explaining what Islam is in 20 pages. So it's in the Maghreb that we have the highest, I would say, intensity of deculturation, and hence, answers to this deculturation, either by reculturation or acculturation, or precisely going for global jihad.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Yeah, my name is Enes Sobrama with the Netherlands Embassy here. About 2 weeks ago, Thomas Friedman wrote one of his famous pieces in the New York Times, Opinion, in which even he had to admit that the promise of reform in Saudi Arabia, including religious reform, is gone because of the killing of Jamal Khashoggi on the 2nd of October. And the position of Mohammed bin Salman is becoming a bit shaky there. So my question to you is that true? And how important is Saudi Arabia at the moment for reform within the Islamic world? My second question is connected to that. You made some remarks, maybe I misinterpreted you, that there's some tendencies or early indications of secularization in the Middle East and North Africa. If we transplant that here to this part of the world, we see that the running mate of President Jokowi, Maruf Amin, is the leader of NUS. So how do you sort of combine these two things? Less maybe Islamism tendency, more secularism, but on the other hand we see in Indonesia, another center of Islam, a running mate who is an Islamic leader in that country.
For the first question, I think that the wrong interpretation was to ask the question, is Mohammed bin Salman a reformer? He's neither a reformer nor a conservative. He's a man of power. No. The issue for him is to have the power. It's not just a personal issue. It's because the Saudi system was, coming to an end. The Saudi system is very simple. You have, call it a tribe, a clan, a family. You have the Saud, and you have the Wahhabi clergy. It's an alliance. The clergy is in charge of the civil society, and the family is in charge of politics and power. And the family is working on was working on a form of consensus. Okay. Of course, they had disagreements, but it was kept inside the house. And for successions, in case of crisis and so on, they found a consensus between themselves. As long as you have, let's say, only a dozen of dominant princes, you can have a consensus. But now that we are arriving at the third generation after Ibn Saud, we have hundreds of princes. and you cannot have a consensus among hundreds of princes. So either you transform the family into a parliament, with vote and so, which is not an option apparently, then it's paralysis, or turning into a system of one man, a power of one man. So MBS took this option, but because it was not based on a consensus, he had to kill the family, to destroy the family, to undermine the family. And he did well, he did well. He's good at the negative action, if I can say that, he did things which were unthinkable. Putting his cousins in jail, racketing them, ransoming them, and so and so. Lacking respect for older people, insulting, uncles and things like that. Something which is unheard of. And for me, it's also part of the deculturation process. Not only he didn't respect, the political code of the family, but he didn't respect politeness, courtesy, the code of honor and attitude that is very important, or at least was very important until now. For the Wahhabi clergy, it's the same thing. He's not a reformist in Islam. For him, it's just a matter of power. Once he has destroyed the family, he had to destroy the clergy, or at least to deprive the clergy of any pretension to political power. So he did that, in 1 week. It's done. And all the sheikhs say, okay, yes, I have nothing to say about politics. I'm in my house, don't worry, and so on and so. But the consequences are tremendous, because he destroyed also the prestige of the Wahhabi clergy. For many, for instance, you take these young guys, in France, Germany, Great Britain, who self-radicalize on internet and so. Many of them go for, they don't all go for terrorism at all. Many of them go for Salafism. And because they didn't listen to their parents, because their parents are out of the game, they are looking for sheikh, shuyukh on internet. And they speak between themselves about who is the best sheikh. I'm asking a fatwa, is camembert halal, for instance? May I eat French cheese? This kind of very important question. And they always find, Mullah online, fatwa online, and so. And the Saudi sheikh, shuyukh, they had a prestige, And suddenly, well, they lost their prestige. They are just now, apolitical, and they obey, these young prince. In Egypt, the Salafi are going for politics. So there is the idea that Salafism is not a political alternative, but a different way of life. Once you join Salafism, you are in a different world, and you can despise the real world. It's dead now. So, but the problem of MBS is that it doesn't provide any alternative. The only political alternative that he has is force. We can say that the Khashoggi affair is more a fault than a crime, maybe. But it shows that he has no other way to ensure his own power. And he's right, he's in danger now, because there is no alternative. So he has fragilized, the system, the Saudi system, and he has undermined the international Wahhabi and Salafi, it's not a system, it's not an institution, but a vision without providing any kind of alternative, neither political nor religious. So it's why it's very fragile. And as far as Nahdlatul Islam is concerned, I think that I mentioned briefly that I don't know about Indonesia, so it's why I don't want to to speak about the countries where I have not been, didn't meet the people, and so. But of course, I'm part of an institution. We have colleagues who are working on that, and we exchange, we discuss. As I said, the alternative of this statization of Islam, this institutionalization of Islam, which is done, by the way, not only in Muslim countries, but in the West. The dream of the Western government is to have a national Islamic church. They want to institutionalize Islam, which is total contradiction for secular states. But that's the official policy in France, for instance. It will never work, but it's the policy. So the alternative, of having either the Salafi who, in fact, enjoy deculturation because they don't care about cultural Islam, and to avoid this dryness of an official Islam, is to have this kind of civil society faith communities, where you find outside politics a spiritual environment, a form of solidarity. And the interesting thing is that we have the development of this kind of brotherhood, fraternities, communities, in countries like Indonesia, in Turkey, until, the government put a limit to that, but also in Catholic countries. Now, in Catholic Europe, the influence of the church is very low, very low. The attendance of Mass, for Mass, is under 10% everywhere except in Poland. And it's even going now around 5% of the population. But you have an increase of non-clerical faith communities, like Comunione Liberazione in Italy, Sant'Egidio, the Focolare, and these movements, which are based on a shared spirituality, are expanding because it corresponds to a demand of the people. So here again, I saw some symmetry. I'll tell you if I have time. I tell you a story. In 2011, so the Italian government decided to organize an informal meeting with people of the Tunisian Mahdat, with the Tunisian Muslim Brothers, because of course Tunisia is close to Italy. And the problem is what to do with the Islamists coming to the power. So Mahdat sent a team and was part of the meeting. And very cleverly, or traditionally, I don't know, so the Italian government asked the local bishop to chair the meeting. And the Muslim brothers, Tunisian Muslim brothers, were very happy about that, to be welcomed by a bishop, and not by a secularist. And the topic of the debate was, is Islamism the Christian democracy of Muslim countries? And for a whole day, we debated, about Christian democracy and so on. But the head of the Tunisian delegation, he asked me about one day, but where are the Christian Democrats? There are no more Christian Democrats, in the audience, nobody was a Christian Democrat. And I told him, no, they are not Christian Democrats. The guys, there were many diplomats, Italian diplomats. The guys are not Christian Democrats. They are part of the Focolare movement, which is a kind of recognized by the church, of lay fraternities, where people, they pray together, they put their money, together, they, and very often they marry together. So, of course, there are some priests among them. That's the guys you are discussing with. And he told me, see, that's interesting, We don't care about Christian democracy, it's past, What we are interested in is how to keep our faith, how to be good Muslims, and how to enter into politics, but not with an ideological Islam. How to combine, our faith as individual and citizenship. And he found that the model, the Italian model, very interesting. I don't know what they are doing with that, but the idea that Ranucci is pushing, is we should stop to put Islam in politics. But we are Muslims, and we are proud to be Muslims. So how to combine both? And So as I told him, the Italians are trying to sell you second-hand cars, but you have to go to the real thing, because there is something in the Italian society which is interesting and could be helpful for you. So it's on what I am working now, this kind of transversality.
Thank you. We still have some time. Does anybody have more questions? Yes.
Thank you. Fanar Haddad from Middle East Institute. I wanted to ask you to expand a bit more on the causality or the causal effect of the statization of Islam, as you called it. Because it struck me that this is something that's hardly new. I mean, if we go back to Ottoman times, the statization of Islam was there, the co-optation of the Azhar in the 20th century, etc., etc. It strikes me that the only place where this is actually novel is in Iran. And in Shia Islam in general, be it in Iraq or in Iran. So that's one question, which also raises the issue of whether it's helpful to think of these in linear terms or whether these are episodic, these bursts, whether it's correct to think of these in linear terms, as in something that has risen and then falls, or in episodic terms, as in bursts of fanaticism in reaction to broader issues. Ultimately, for example, in terms of the Emirates that you started your lecture with, the Emirates across that swath of land seem to ultimately be the function of, state failure and the collapse of governance in various areas, much more than religion or ideology or tribal dynamics. The second question I'd like to ask you, again to bring it back to Saudi Arabia, isn't there the possibility that Mohammed bin Salman's crackdown on the clergy has created many living martyrs? And it strikes me that these living martyrs are the very same clerics that the young European men and women that you mentioned used to refer to. I'm thinking of Awad al-Garni, I'm thinking of Safar al-Hawali, Salman al-Auda. They're all still alive and they refuse to yield. So I'd just like to get your thoughts on where that might go and whether a backlash is being created as we speak. Thank you.
From the last question, but yes, as you'd say, it's very difficult to see what is temporary, what is long-term. So we don't see any cult of martyrs as far as the Salafi leaders who are jailed or under pressure from the Saudi government are concerned. But okay, that's now. What will happen in 1, 2, or 3 years, it's open. From the first part, what I call statization is not political control. You always had the political control of Islam by any kind of de facto power in Muslim countries. What we have is a transformation of the clerks into a state bureaucracy. So it's something more in depth, more important. And the interesting thing is that the starting point was not the Muslim countries. It started, for instance, with Stalin, who created the official muftiya, totally controlled by the state. So we have now this trend to have a national muftiya, national Sharul Islam, homogenization of the training, hierarchy between the different imams, the fact that the state administration is in charge of producing the preaches, controlling the books, and so on and so on. That's a general trend, statization of the clergy. In Iran, it's different between the clergy. It's the only place in Islam when you had an institutional clergy, an autonomous, institutionalized clergy. And this tradition is under threat of politicization. They are eaten by the state, if I can say that. In Iran, they often speak of the state mullahs, the mullahs who played politics. And I think that what was typical of Iran, the juxtaposition of a clergy and a revolutionary state, is now in jeopardy because I think that there will be a crisis after the death of Khamenei, the present guide. And there is no real clerical alternative. I don't see, I may be wrong, but I don't see any credible personality who could replace Khamenei and keep, this alliance between the clergy, or the majority of the clergy, and the state. So I foresee more or less the coming into power of the Pazaran, of the Revolutionary Guards, which will turn Iran into a far more classical military dictatorship. The exceptionalism of Iran, I think, is reaching its limits. That's so. And as I said, in the West, under different ways, our governments are trying to set up a good Muslim church. And by good, they mean a moderate. And by moderate, they mean people, for the majority of the public opinion in the West, a moderate believer is somebody who believes moderately. And this is a problem, because when people are religious-minded, they don't believe moderately, So it's all the contradiction for a secular state to manage religion.
Thank you.
Yes, we have time for a couple more questions, I think. Yes.
You have been one of the earliest writers, researchers on Islamism. You have made many predictions. I want to ask you of the key predictions that you made. What predictions have come true and what predictions have not come true? I have also a second question. We have seen Afghanistan emerging as a new epicenter or a renewal of threat, movement of foreign fighters. Even Southeast Asians have now gone to Afghanistan more recently. Do you think that the low-level conflict in Afghanistan will escalate by next year and in the coming years, and it will become another conflict of the scale and intensity of Iraq and Syria in the future? Thank you.
So my main mistake was about Afghanistan. I thought that after the Western military intervention in 2001, that the Afghans would find, a way to not to go back to the good old times of the monarchy, but to establish an acceptable state, a weak state, of course, but that could be acceptable for the majority of the population. I didn't expect the Taliban to increase, in influence. Now, I always said that the key in Afghanistan is ethnicity. I always said that. And the Taliban, for me, are the expression of a Pashtun nationalism, which felt betrayed by the fact that the Western intervention ended with the people of the North taking the power in Kabul. And the people of the North, which I knew very well, have not been able to be at the, I would say, the level of the historical responsibility. So it's a political failure for everybody, Afghanistan. So the solution is negotiating with the Taliban. And the Taliban are not global jihadists at all. It's more what I call Islamo-nationalism. The Taliban always spoke of Afghanistan. They never speak about the Emirates of Khorasan and things like that. The Taliban always recognize diplomacy. They had the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They had ambassadors. they learn a lot also, and now they're challenged, by a more radical generation or local clans pledging allegiance to ISIS. So the Taliban are also under pressure. So I think that a political solution is possible, but the country is in horrible condition. For the rest, my best prediction is the failure of political Islam, a book I wrote in 1991, when I said that the concept of Islamic State doesn't stand. So the Islamists, at that time it was Muslim Brothers, Jamaat, and so, had two options. One is going mainstream, like Erdogan, Hanouchi, etc., or neo-fundamentalism, which now could be termed Salafism. And still, it's that, these tensions between political Islam trying to find a role in certain form of democracy, even if it's a illiberal democracy like in Turkey now, and withdrawal on a strict application of not necessarily Sharia as a state law, but as a way of life. So that's my something stick. I've always said that, and it's I stick to my previous opinion on that. I think that what is going on is demonstrating the validity of the book, which is still to sell. So you can go to the best bookshop and you will find it. Even in Malay.
Okay. Well, I think we have run out of time. So unless somebody has got a really pressing question that cannot wait, and you can't sleep unless you ask it, I think I ask you to sit in your seats. Join me in expressing our appreciation to Professor Roy in the normal way. And please accept this small token of our appreciation, a souvenir of Singapore. Yeah. But don't ask me what it is, because I don't know. Oh, no, it wasn't. You can leave it here, somebody will give it to you. Sorry. Thank you very much. Thank you. Come. If he wants to take another picture, he's photographer. I'm never satisfied. Why don't I ask the remaining board members to come and join us for a photograph?